When Sarah Mitchell walked out of Morton and Associates with a cardboard box in her arms, most assumed it was just another corporate casualty. Another talented black woman deemed too loud for the workplace. Another victory for Gerald Thompson, the marketing firm's notoriously biased regional manager. They couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah wasn't just carrying her belongings that day. She was carrying the blueprint for a revolution that would shake corporate America to its core. Sarah Mitchell stood before her office mirror, adjusting her blazer one final time. Her law degree from Harvard gleamed on the wall behind her reflection, a reminder of the countless nights she'd spent studying, the sacrifices her single mother had made, and the determination that had driven her to graduate at the top of her class. But today, none of that mattered to Gerald Thompson, the regional manager of Morton and Associates marketing agency, where Sarah had worked as a senior account executive for the past 3 years. "Ms. Mitchell, your behavior is becoming increasingly disruptive," Gerald said, his thin lips barely moving as he spoke. He sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled, looking down at her through wire-rimmed glasses. "Several colleagues have complained about your animated discussions during meetings." Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart raced. She knew exactly what this was about. Last week's presentation had landed their firm the biggest account of the quarter, largely due to her passionate pitch and innovative strategy. The client had loved her energy, her enthusiasm, her confident delivery. But apparently some people in the office had different opinions. "Mr. Thompson, I maintain a professional demeanor at all times," Sarah responded, keeping her voice steady. "My presentation style has consistently brought positive results for this company. Our latest client specifically mentioned—" "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Gerald interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "This constant need to be the center of attention, to dominate conversations. It's not fitting for our corporate culture." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She'd heard these coded words before, seen the sideways glances when she celebrated a victory, noticed how her white colleagues were passionate while she was aggressive. They were enthusiastic while she was loud. "I've been the top performer in my department for 2 years running," Sarah said, laying out the facts like the lawyer she'd trained to be. "My clients have a 95% retention rate, the highest in the company's history. I've brought in over $12 million in new business this year alone." Gerald's pale face flushed slightly. "Numbers aren't everything, Ms. Mitchell. We have a certain image to maintain. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in a different environment, one more suited to your natural disposition." The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah's hands curled into fists beneath the desk, her manicured nails pressing into her palms. She thought of her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to put her through school, who'd taught her to hold her head high no matter what. She thought of her younger sister Jessica, now in law school herself, looking up to Sarah as a role model. "Are you firing me, Mr. Thompson?" Sarah asked, her voice calm, despite the storm raging inside her. "We're terminating your employment, effective immediately," Gerald replied, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. "You'll find your severance package inside. Human Resources will escort you to clear out your desk." As Sarah stood, her chair scraping against the floor, Gerald added with a smirk, "Try not to make a scene on your way out. We wouldn't want to disturb the office any further." Sarah gathered her dignity around her like armor and walked out of his office, past the curious eyes of her soon-to-be former colleagues. Among them was Linda from HR, already waiting with an empty box, and Thomas Green, Gerald's golden boy who'd been gunning for her accounts, despite his mediocre performance record. What Gerald Thompson didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn about the woman he'd just fired, was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any senior account executive. She was also a board member of the National Association for Corporate Equality, a founding partner of the Mitchell-Jones Foundation for Workplace Justice, and the daughter of federal judge Marion Mitchell, who had made headlines throughout her career for landmark decisions in employment discrimination cases. But more importantly, Sarah had spent her nights and weekends over the past year meticulously documenting every instance of discrimination she'd witnessed at Morton and Associates. Every passed-over promotion, every racially charged comment, every culture-fit discussion that somehow always ended with qualified minority candidates being rejected. Her Harvard law degree hadn't just been gathering dust on her wall. She'd been building a case. As she packed her awards and photos into the cardboard box, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend and law school classmate, Aisha Rodriguez, now a partner at one of the city's most prestigious civil rights law firms. They'd been preparing for this day, knowing it would come eventually. The pieces were already in motion. In his office, Gerald Thompson straightened his tie and smiled, satisfied with how he'd handled the situation. He picked up his phone to call Thomas Green about taking over Sarah's accounts. The marketing world was small, after all, and he'd make sure Sarah Mitchell wouldn't find another position at any respectable agency in the city. Little did he know, but his day of reckoning was approaching. Sarah Mitchell had learned long ago that the best revenge wasn't served loud. It was served methodically, strategically, and with impeccable documentation. As Sarah walked out of Morton and Associates for the last time, the security guard, Eddie, who'd always been kind to her, held the door. "You take care, Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, slipping her a folded piece of paper. "Those security cameras you asked about, they record audio too. Always have." Sarah smiled, tucking the paper into her pocket. The pieces were falling into place. While Gerald Thompson celebrated his victory in his corner office, Sarah Mitchell was about to remind him of an important lesson. Karma doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a perfectly prepared legal document, served with a smile. What happened next would shake Morton and Associates to its foundations, but that story was just beginning to unfold. The real question wasn't whether justice would be served, but how many others would be caught in the avalanche that Gerald Thompson had unwittingly triggered with his signature on her termination papers. As Sarah placed her box in the trunk of her Tesla Model S, another detail Gerald had never bothered to notice about his culturally unsuitable employee, she pulled out her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to her mother, Judge Mitchell, who answered on the first ring. The second was to her old friend Michael Chang at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who had been waiting for her call for months. The game was about to change, but Sarah Mitchell wasn't just playing chess while Gerald played checkers. She'd already set up the board, positioned her pieces, and calculated 20 moves ahead. After all, that's what Harvard Law had taught her. Success isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing exactly when and how to use your voice to create lasting change. And Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. Meanwhile, back in his office, Gerald Thompson was about to learn another valuable lesson. Sometimes, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who has quietly built an ironclad case while you were too busy being bigoted to notice the storm gathering on your horizon. The next morning, while Gerald Thompson sipped his overpriced artisanal coffee and delegated Sarah's accounts to Thomas Green, Sarah was sitting in a sunlit conference room 30 floors above Park Avenue. Around the massive glass table sat an assembled team that would have made Gerald choke on his coffee had he known. To her left was Aisha Rodriguez, whose law firm had won 3 major discrimination suits in the past year alone. Across from her sat Michael Chang from the EEOC, his tablet displaying years of complaints against Morton and Associates, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from official records but had found their way into Sarah's carefully maintained files. "They've settled 4 times in the past decade," Michael said, sliding graphs across the table. "Always quietly, always with NDAs, but patterns like this don't stay buried forever." Dr. Regina Watson, a prominent workplace culture consultant and expert witness in discrimination cases, nodded as she reviewed the documentation. "The statistical deviation in promotion rates alone is damning, but what interests me most is this pattern of language in performance reviews." She pulled up a series of evaluations that Sarah had collected. The differences were stark. Male employees were confident and assertive, while women, especially women of color, were consistently labeled as aggressive or difficult. White employees were team players who fit the culture, while minorities were told they needed to adapt or tone it down. But Sarah's masterstroke wasn't just the documentation of her own experience. Over the years, she'd built relationships with former employees, gathering their stories, their emails, their performance reviews. Eddie, the security guard, wasn't the only one who'd kept records. Janet from accounting had spreadsheets, Marcus from creative had emails, and Diane from legal had quietly copied key documents before her own resignation 2 years ago. "What Gerald doesn't realize," Sarah explained, is that every person he pushed out didn't just disappear. We found each other. We built a network, and we waited. Meanwhile, across town, Gerald was having a very different kind of meeting. Thomas Green sat across from him, reviewing Sarah's client files with poorly concealed glee. "I always knew she wasn't right for this company," Thomas said, straightening his tie. A perfect match to Gerald's own preferred style. You know, Gerald nodded, pleased with his protégé's understanding. "The client list is yours, Thomas. Just maintain them better than she did. Less of that enthusiasm." What neither man noticed was Linda from HR hovering outside the office door, her phone discreetly recording their conversation. Linda, who had played the compliant HR director for years while maintaining her own detailed records, had finally reached her breaking point. Her resignation letter was already drafted, and her testimony would soon join the growing chorus of voices Sarah had orchestrated. By lunch, the first tremors of the earthquake Sarah had triggered began to ripple through Morton and Associates. A routine call from the Department of Labor about employment records, an inquiry from the state's Civil Rights Commission, a message from one of the firm's biggest clients asking for clarification about some troubling rumors regarding their diversity practices. Gerald dismissed each one with his usual arrogance, unaware that these were just the opening moves in a much larger game. He didn't notice when 3 junior associates, all minorities, requested their complete personnel files from HR. He missed the significance of the company's internal messaging system being down for routine maintenance, while IT backed up years of communication logs. That afternoon, as Gerald prepared for his weekly board meeting, his phone lit up with a text from his daughter Emily, a second-year law student. "Dad, you need to call me. It's about Sarah Mitchell." Emily had just attended a guest lecture at her law school, given by none other than Judge Marion Mitchell, who had used a hypothetical case study that sounded eerily familiar to demonstrate modern techniques of proving workplace discrimination. But Gerald was too busy to return his daughter's call. He had a more pressing concern. Thomas Green was already struggling with Sarah's former clients. The Jacobson account, their biggest win of the quarter, was demanding a meeting with that brilliant woman who handled their initial pitch. "Just handle it, Thomas," Gerald snapped. "She's gone. Make it work." What he didn't know was that Sarah had anticipated this too. Before leaving, she'd sent each of her major clients a detailed transition memo, ostensibly to ensure smooth continuity of service. But buried in each memo were subtle reminders of her contributions, her strategies, and her relationship with each client, all documented and dated, all proving her value to the company she'd just been fired from. As the day drew to a close, Gerald finally checked his voicemail and found a message from the company's outside counsel requesting an urgent meeting first thing tomorrow morning. He deleted it without listening to the end, confident in his position, his authority, and his judgment. Up in her penthouse apartment, Sarah reviewed the day's developments with her team. Emails were flowing in from current and former employees, each adding their story to the growing testament of Morton and Associates' toxic culture. Security footage from Eddie had been safely backed up. Linda from HR had made contact through secure channels. But Sarah wasn't rushing to pull the trigger. She'd learned from her mother that justice, like revenge, was a dish best served at the perfect temperature. Too hot, and people could claim emotional decisions. Too cold, and evidence could be explained away. The timing had to be just right. "Tomorrow," she told her team, "we let Gerald Thompson go about his normal routine. Let him feel secure. Let him continue making mistakes. Because the day after that..." She left the sentence unfinished, but everyone in the room knew what was coming. They'd seen the preliminary legal documents, the press releases waiting in drafts, the carefully prepared statements from former employees. They'd reviewed the financial impact analyses, the reputational damage assessments, the probable defense strategies Morton and Associates would attempt. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. Because Sarah Mitchell hadn't just built a case, she'd constructed a mechanism of accountability that would change not only Morton and Associates, but potentially set precedents for corporate culture across the industry. As night fell over the city, Gerald Thompson slept soundly in his suburban home, unaware that his professional world was about to undergo a seismic shift. But in apartments and offices across the city, dozens of people were awake, finalizing testimonies, organizing documents, and preparing for what would soon become a landmark case in corporate accountability. The stage was set. The players were in position, and Sarah Mitchell, the woman Gerald had dismissed as too loud, was about to demonstrate the true power of speaking up, not with volume, but with irrefutable truth and methodically gathered evidence. The real storm hadn't even begun. Dawn broke over the city skyline as Gerald Thompson arrived early at his office, irritated by the growing stack of urgent messages on his desk. His secretary, Monica, had already called in sick the third time this week. Oddly, several other employees were also absent, though Gerald was too preoccupied to notice the pattern. The morning's first crisis hit before he'd finished his coffee. The Jacobson account, their biggest client, had sent an email at 3 a.m. copying the entire board of directors. They were reevaluating their partnership, following some disturbing information about the company's employment practices. Gerald's hands shook as he read the carefully worded email, which specifically mentioned their disappointment in losing touch with their key account representative. "Thomas!" Gerald bellowed, but Thomas Green was mysteriously absent from his desk. Instead, Linda from HR appeared in his doorway, her usual accommodating smile replaced by a look of professional detachment. "Mr. Thompson, the legal department is requesting all performance reviews and personnel files from the past 5 years. They need them within the hour." "What? Why?" Gerald snapped, his face reddening. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that," Linda replied, her voice steady. "But you should know that, as of this morning, I've accepted a position elsewhere. My resignation letter has been sent to the board." Before Gerald could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Green. "Can't come in today. Need to speak with my lawyer first." Gerald's stomach churned. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't quite piece it together. He reached for his phone to call the company's legal team, only to find his access to the internal directory had been suspended for routine security updates. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Mitchell was conducting a very different kind of meeting. In a private room at the city's most prestigious law firm, she sat with representatives from 5 other major marketing agencies. These weren't just any representatives, they were the heads of their diversity and inclusion committees, their general counsels, their HR directors. "What's happening at Morton & Associates isn't unique," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "But how we respond to it could change our entire industry." She laid out her vision, not just a lawsuit, but a complete overhaul of how marketing agencies handled diversity, equity, and inclusion. The evidence she'd gathered wouldn't just expose Gerald Thompson. It would shed light on systemic issues plaguing the entire sector. Back at Morton & Associates, the morning grew increasingly chaotic. The board called an emergency meeting, but Gerald found himself deliberately excluded. His keycard access to the executive floor was temporarily malfunctioning. His emails to the board members bounced back undelivered. By noon, social media was buzzing with whispers. A hashtag started trending. Morton discrimination. Former employees began sharing their stories, each one carefully vetted and documented by Sarah's team before release. The posts weren't angry rants, they were professional, measured accounts of systemic discrimination, each backed by dated emails, performance reviews, and witness statements. Gerald's daughter Emily finally reached him on his personal cell phone. "Dad, you need to listen to me," she pleaded. "Do you have any idea who Sarah Mitchell is? Do you know what's about to happen?" But before she could explain, Gerald's line was disconnected by the company's IT department for security purposes. He stood at his office window, watching as news vans began to gather outside the building. Linda from HR had already begun her exit interview, not with Morton & Associates, but with the state's labor board. She wasn't alone. A steady stream of current and former employees had been cycling through government offices all morning, each carrying folders of documentation that Sarah had helped them organize over the past year. The company's outside counsel finally managed to reach Gerald around 2 p.m. The message was brief and clear. Do not speak to anyone. Do not delete any files. Do not attempt to contact any current or former employees. Await further instructions. But it was too late for warnings. Gerald had already made several panicked phone calls that morning, all of them recorded, all of them documenting his increasingly desperate attempts to contain a situation he still didn't fully understand. Sarah, watching the events unfold from her command center, received regular updates from her network within Morton & Associates. Each new development was cataloged, each reaction documented. She had anticipated Gerald's moves with chess master precision, knowing his pride would lead him to make crucial mistakes in these first crucial hours. The afternoon brought a new wave of revelations. An anonymous source, though Gerald would later suspect it was Thomas Green, leaked a recording of a management meeting from 6 months ago. In it, Gerald could be clearly heard discussing the need to maintain certain standards and preserve the company culture, followed by explicit instructions on how to discourage certain types from advancing within the company. Industry publications began picking up the story. Competitors started distancing themselves from Morton and Associates. Clients began publicly announcing reviews of their relationships with the agency. But Sarah Mitchell's name was notably absent from all public discussion. She remained in the shadows, orchestrating a movement that was rapidly growing beyond Gerald Thompson and Morton and Associates. Her mother, Judge Mitchell, had taught her well. True change doesn't come from a single lawsuit or a moment of public shame. It comes from changing the entire system. As the workday drew to a close, Gerald Thompson sat alone in his office, his phone silent, his email frozen, his authority evaporated. Through his window, he could see more news vans arriving, their satellite dishes extending toward the darkening sky. What he didn't see was Sarah Mitchell, sitting in her own office 30 blocks away, reviewing the final documents that would be served tomorrow morning. Documents that would reveal not just Gerald's discrimination, but a decade-long pattern of systematic bias that reached into every corner of Morton and Associates and beyond. The story was about to break wide open, but Sarah wasn't finished. This was never just about Gerald Thompson. It was about changing an entire industry's culture, about setting precedents that would affect thousands of lives. And tomorrow's revelations would make today's chaos look like merely the opening act. The next morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. Gerald Thompson sat in his home office, having been strongly advised by company lawyers to work remotely. His wife, Catherine, watched the morning news with growing horror as Morton and Associates' name scrolled across the ticker tape beneath stories of corporate discrimination. But the real bombshell dropped at exactly 9 a.m. when every major news outlet simultaneously received a comprehensive press package. It wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell anymore. The documents revealed a systematic pattern of discrimination that spanned 15 years, 6 regional offices, and involved over 200 employees. Sarah's team had done more than gather evidence. They'd created a database tracking every instance of discrimination, every biased comment, every passed-over promotion. The data painted a picture so clear and damning that even the most skeptical journalists couldn't ignore it. At 9:15 a.m., the first class action lawsuit was filed. By 9:30, Morton & Associates stock had plunged 12%. By 10, the board of directors had called an emergency meeting, notably without Gerald present. Meanwhile, in a sleek downtown office building, Sarah sat with her expanding team, monitoring the situation. But she wasn't celebrating yet. This was just phase 1. Gerald Thompson isn't an anomaly, she explained to the assembled group of lawyers, activists, and industry leaders. He's a symptom of a much larger problem, and we're going to use this moment to address the root cause. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other employees across different agencies, all sharing similar stories. The Morton discrimination hashtag had evolved into Marketing Equity Now, spawning a movement that was rapidly spreading through the industry. Back at his home, Gerald finally opened the thick envelope that had been courier-delivered that morning. As he read through the documents, the color drained from his face. Not only had Sarah documented every discriminatory action he'd taken against her, but she'd also uncovered his pattern of behavior, stretching back to his first management position 20 years ago. There were testimonies from former employees he'd long forgotten, emails he thought had been deleted, performance reviews that showed clear bias when analyzed in aggregate. But most damning of all was the audio, hundreds of hours of recorded meetings, where he'd openly discussed his preferences for certain types of employees. His phone rang. It was Thomas Green. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "They have everything. The fake performance reviews we wrote together, the client meetings we excluded minority team members from, the promotions we blocked. I've been offered immunity in exchange for my testimony." Gerald slumped in his chair as his carefully constructed world continued to crumble. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't done yet. At noon, she finally stepped into the public eye, holding a press conference that would be remembered as a turning point in corporate American history. She stood at the podium, poised and powerful, surrounded by a diverse group of current and former employees from across the industry. "What happened at Morton & Associates isn't unique," she began, her voice clear and measured. "But how we respond to it will be. Today we're announcing the formation of the Corporate Equality Initiative, a coalition of industry leaders committed to real, measurable change." She unveiled a comprehensive plan that went far beyond just Morton & Associates. Major agencies had already signed on, committing to independent audits, transparent hiring practices, and measurable diversity goals. The initiative included mentorship programs, educational outreach, and a legal defense fund for employees facing discrimination. By mid-afternoon, Gerald's world had completely unraveled. The board voted unanimously to terminate him, effective immediately. But his firing wasn't a quiet, dignified exit. It was broadcast live on business news channels, accompanied by a stern statement from the board condemning his actions and announcing a complete overhaul of company leadership. What Gerald didn't know was that Sarah had anticipated this moment months ago. She'd already identified several qualified candidates from underrepresented backgrounds who could step into leadership roles at Morton & Associates. Their resumes had been quietly circulated to board members who were now eager to demonstrate their commitment to change. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected direction. The industry's largest trade association announced they were revoking Gerald's Lifetime Achievement Award, which he'd received just last year. They were also establishing a new annual award for promoting diversity and inclusion in marketing, named the Sarah Mitchell Excellence in Leadership Award. As evening approached, Gerald sat in his dark home office, his phone silent except for calls from reporters and lawyers. His country club membership had been temporarily suspended. Friends and colleagues weren't returning his calls. Even his daughter Emily had posted a lengthy statement on LinkedIn, distancing herself from his actions and expressing support for the Corporate Equality Initiative. But in a bright, buzzing office across town, Sarah Mitchell was still working. The lawsuit, the press conference, the industry initiative, these were just the beginning. She had a larger vision, one that would transform not just her industry, but corporate America itself. Tomorrow, she would testify before a congressional committee on workplace discrimination. Next week, she would launch a nationwide speaking tour. Plans were already in motion for a book, a consulting firm, and a foundation dedicated to corporate equality. The storm wasn't over. It was spreading, growing, becoming a force for genuine change. And somewhere in his darkened home office, Gerald Thompson was finally beginning to understand just how loud Sarah Mitchell's voice could really be. But even this wasn't the end of the story, because Sarah Mitchell had one final card to play, one that would shake the very foundations of corporate America. The following morning, as Gerald Thompson contemplated the ruins of his career over cold coffee, Sarah Mitchell unveiled the final piece of her master plan, one that had been in development long before her firing. She hadn't just been building a case against Morton & Associates. She'd been creating an artificial intelligence system that could detect patterns of workplace discrimination. Working with a team of data scientists and employment lawyers over the past 2 years, she had developed an algorithm that could analyze corporate communications, hiring practices, and promotion patterns to identify systemic bias. The system, named Equity, evaluating qualification undertakings independently through yearly analysis, had been secretly processing data from hundreds of companies across multiple industries. The results were staggering. At her morning press conference, Sarah revealed Phase 2 of the Corporate Equality Initiative. "Today we're launching a voluntary audit program," she announced. "Companies can submit their HR data to Equity for independent analysis. Those that pass will receive certification as Equal Opportunity Employers of Excellence. Those that don't will receive detailed guidance on addressing their issues." The genius of her plan wasn't just in exposing discrimination, it was in providing a solution. Companies could either voluntarily address their problems or risk being exposed when their employees inevitably came forward with equity reports backing their claims. Meanwhile, Gerald found himself facing an unexpected crisis at home. His wife, Catherine, after spending the night reading through the full documentation of his actions, had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to stay with my sister. Emily was right about you all along. Don't call until you've spoken with my lawyer." But personal problems were the least of Gerald's worries. By mid-morning, the district attorney's office announced an investigation into potential criminal charges. It seemed some of Gerald's methods of suppressing complaints had crossed legal boundaries. The evidence Sarah had gathered suggested witness intimidation, document falsification, and potential fraud in federal employment reports. At Morton and Associates, the transformation was already underway. The board had appointed Dr. Maya Rodriguez, a highly respected organizational psychologist and diversity expert, as interim CEO. Her first act was to announce a complete review of all personnel decisions made during Gerald's tenure. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Major tech companies wanted to implement equity. Universities wanted her to speak. Government agencies wanted to consult on policy reform. But she remained focused on her primary goal: systematic, lasting change. By afternoon, the story had gone international. Companies worldwide were facing pressure to adopt the equity system. Investment firms announced they would consider equity certification in their evaluation criteria. The hashtag #AnjShow, Your Equity, was trending globally. Gerald, watching the coverage from his empty home, finally understood the full magnitude of what Sarah had built. She hadn't just ended his career. She'd created a tool that would make it impossible for others to follow in his footsteps. But the real surprise came at 3 p.m. when Sarah Mitchell walked into Morton and Associates' lobby. Not as a former employee, not as an adversary, but as the newly appointed head of their board's Ethics and Equality Committee. The same board that had rubber-stamped her firing 2 days ago had now given her oversight of the company's entire transformation process. This was never about revenge, she told the assembled employees, many of whom had secretly supported her all along. This is about creating lasting change. Morton and Associates isn't just going to survive this. We're going to become a model for corporate equality. As she spoke, her phone buzzed with news that the ripple effects were spreading. Other marketing agencies were scrambling to implement diversity initiatives. Industry publications were rewriting their award criteria. Business schools were updating their curricula to include case studies based on her campaign. Gerald, meanwhile, received another unwelcome surprise. His daughter Emily had accepted an internship with Sarah's new consulting firm, determined to be part of the solution rather than perpetuating the problem. But Sarah wasn't finished. As evening approached, she met with a select group of corporate leaders who had flown in from around the country. They weren't there to defend the old way of doing things. They were there to learn how to change. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, Sarah explained, standing before a room of CEOs and board members. It's bad business. And now, thanks to equity, it's also impossible to hide. The system was already processing data from volunteers at other companies, identifying patterns that had gone unnoticed or unreported for years. Each analysis provided more training data, making the AI more sophisticated at detecting subtle forms of bias. As night fell over the city, Sarah returned to her office, where a team of developers was fine-tuning the next version of equity. The system was learning, growing, becoming more sophisticated at identifying the kind of subtle discrimination that had plagued corporate America for decades. Meanwhile, in his darkened home study, Gerald Thompson opened his laptop to find hundreds of unread emails. Among them was one from Sarah Mitchell herself. The subject line read, "The Future of Corporate Equality." His hand trembled as he moved the cursor to open it, knowing that whatever it contained would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others in corporate America. The question was, would he finally learn from his mistakes, or would he become just another case study in equity's growing database? The message he was about to read would set in motion events that would reshape not just one company or industry, but the entire landscape of American business. Gerald's cursor hovered over Sarah's email for several long minutes before he finally clicked. The message was shorter than he expected. "Mr. Thompson, tomorrow at 9 a.m., I'm testifying before Congress about workplace discrimination. I'm offering you the chance to do the same, not as my opponent, but as someone who can help others understand how unconscious bias becomes systemic discrimination. Your choice. Either way, equity has already identified 147 companies with patterns similar to what you established at Morton and Associates. Change is coming, with or without your testimony. Sarah Mitchell. Attached was a train ticket to Washington, D.C., and an agenda for the congressional hearing. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for what would become a historic testimony. But first, she had another meeting, this one with a group of international business leaders who had flown in overnight. Equity doesn't just identify problems, she explained to the assembled executives. It predicts them. The algorithm can detect early warning signs of discriminatory culture before it becomes systemic. The presentation screen behind her displayed real-time data from companies voluntarily submitting to equity analysis. Patterns emerged, certain phrases in job postings that discouraged diverse candidates, meeting dynamics that systematically silenced minority voices, promotion practices that created invisible barriers. But the system's most powerful feature was its ability to learn. Each new case, each piece of documentation, each recorded instance of discrimination made it more sophisticated at identifying subtle forms of bias. As Sarah's team continued their presentation, Gerald Thompson sat in his study, still staring at her email. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Emily. "Dad, this is your chance to be part of the solution. Don't waste it." By morning, news networks were buzzing with anticipation of the congressional hearing, but the real story was happening behind the scenes. Equity had begun processing data from government contractors, revealing patterns of discrimination that crossed international borders. Sarah arrived at the Capitol building early, her team armed with data, testimonies, and irrefutable evidence of systemic discrimination across industries. As she prepared her notes, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Gerald Thompson looked different, smaller somehow, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been humility. "Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." But before their conversation could continue, the hearing was called to order. Sarah took her place at the witness table, facing the assembled members of Congress. The cameras rolled as she began her testimony. "Distinguished members of Congress, what I'm about to share isn't just about one company or one manager. It's about a system that has allowed discrimination to flourish in the shadows. Today, that changes." She introduced equity to the congressional committee, demonstrating its capabilities in real time. The algorithm processed employment data from a major government contractor, revealing patterns of discrimination that had gone unnoticed for decades. "But technology alone isn't the answer," Sarah continued. "We need systematic change, new legislation, and, most importantly, accountability." Then she did something unexpected. She turned to where Gerald sat in the gallery and gestured for him to join her. A murmur rippled through the chamber as he made his way to the witness table. For the next hour, Gerald Thompson did something he'd never done before. He told the truth about his biases, about the corporate culture he'd helped create, about the countless careers he'd stunted or destroyed. His testimony was painful, honest, and revealing. Back at Morton & Associates, employees gathered in the break room to watch the live coverage. Dr. Rodriguez, the interim CEO, used the moment to announce sweeping changes: transparent pay scales, blind resume screening, mentorship programs, and mandatory bias training, all powered by Equity's analytics. But across town, in a secure server room, Sarah's tech team noticed something interesting. Equity had begun identifying patterns they hadn't programmed it to find: subtle connections between corporate culture, employee satisfaction, and company performance. The AI was revealing something revolutionary. Diverse companies weren't just more equitable, they were more profitable. As the congressional hearing continued, Sarah's phone lit up with messages from around the world. Companies were voluntarily submitting their data to Equity. Employee groups were organizing. Law firms were preparing class action suits based on Equity's analyses. The system had grown beyond its original purpose, becoming a catalyst for global change. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't satisfied yet. Because in the midst of processing all this corporate data, Equity had discovered something else, a pattern so profound it would shake the foundations of modern business. And as Gerald Thompson finished his testimony, his voice shaking but honest, Sarah prepared to reveal the discovery that would transform not just corporate America, but the very nature of workplace equality. The algorithm had begun to map connections between discriminatory practices and major corporate failures, revealing how bias didn't just hurt individuals, it predicted company collapse. Equity wasn't just a tool for identifying discrimination. It had become an early warning system for corporate failure. As the hearing drew to a close, Sarah's team was already preparing for the next phase. Because Equity had just identified a pattern across multiple Fortune 500 companies that suggested an imminent crisis, one that only systemic change could prevent. The pattern Equity had identified was staggering in its implications. The algorithm had discovered a direct correlation between discriminatory practices and major market downturns. Companies with the highest levels of systemic bias were consistently the first to fail during economic crises. And according to Equity's predictive analytics, another crisis was looming. The data is unambiguous, Sarah explained to an emergency session of the Securities and Exchange Commission the following day. Companies with discriminatory practices show specific vulnerabilities: decreased innovation, higher turnover costs, missed market opportunities, and critically flawed decision-making patterns. The SEC commissioners sat in stunned silence as she displayed Equity's findings. The system had identified 27 major corporations on the brink of collapse, all sharing the same toxic cultural patterns that had characterized Morton and Associates. Meanwhile, Gerald Thompson had begun his own transformation. Following his congressional testimony, he'd received an unexpected offer, not for redemption, but for purpose. A coalition of reformed executives, all former perpetrators of discriminatory practices, wanted him to help build a rehabilitation program for corporate leaders. "We can't just remove toxic leadership," he told Sarah during a quiet moment between hearings. "We have to show them how to change, or they'll just take their biases to other companies." Sarah considered his words carefully. Equity had already begun tracking the movement of executives between companies, showing how discriminatory practices spread like a virus through corporate America. Gerald's insight added a human element to the data. Back at Morton and Associates, Dr. Rodriguez was implementing what would become known as the Mitchell Protocol, a comprehensive system for corporate transformation. The company that had once been a case study in discrimination was becoming a model for change. But Equity wasn't done revealing its secrets. The system had begun identifying positive patterns as well. Companies with truly inclusive cultures were showing remarkable resilience to market pressures. More importantly, it had started predicting the emergence of innovative solutions from diverse teams that homogeneous groups had overlooked. Sarah's phone rang. It was her mother, Judge Mitchell. "The Supreme Court wants to see your data," she said without preamble. "Equity's findings could influence employment law for generations." As Sarah prepared for the Supreme Court presentation, her team made another breakthrough. Equity had begun mapping the economic cost of discrimination across entire industries, calculating the trillions of dollars in lost productivity, missed innovations, and squandered talent. The numbers were so compelling that major investment firms began requiring equity certification before funding companies. Venture capital firms started using the system to evaluate startups' cultural health alongside their financial projections. Gerald, watching these developments from his new role, felt a complex mix of emotions. His old world was crumbling, but from its ruins, something better was emerging. His daughter Emily had become one of Equity's leading analysts, helping other companies avoid the mistakes her father had made. Then came the morning that changed everything. Equity's algorithms detected a pattern so significant that its servers triggered an automatic alert. The system had identified a connection between corporate discrimination and global economic stability. Sarah stood in the monitoring room, watching as the data flowed across multiple screens. "It's not just about individual companies anymore," she realized. "The entire global economy is connected to these patterns of inequality." She immediately called an emergency meeting with international financial regulators. Representatives from the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and major central banks gathered in a secure video conference. "What we're seeing isn't just a corporate issue," Sarah explained, sharing Equity's latest findings. "Systemic discrimination is creating vulnerabilities in the global financial system itself." The algorithm had mapped how bias-driven decision-making in major corporations created ripple effects through supply chains, financial markets, and entire economies. But it had also identified something else, a solution. As Sarah prepared to present Equity's most groundbreaking discovery yet, Gerald Thompson sat in his office at the Rehabilitation Center, reviewing resumes of executives seeking to change. On his desk was a framed quote from his congressional testimony. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes it's the one that speaks the truth others are afraid to hear. Meanwhile, in Silicon Valley, Tokyo, London, and Dubai, equity servers continued processing data, uncovering patterns, and mapping the complex relationships between corporate culture and global prosperity. The system had evolved beyond its original purpose, becoming something no one, not even Sarah, had anticipated. And in a quiet moment before her next presentation, Sarah Mitchell looked out over the city skyline, knowing that what she was about to reveal would fundamentally change not just corporate America, but the entire global economy. Because equity had discovered something that would prove once and for all that equality wasn't just a moral imperative, it was an economic necessity. The world was about to change again, and this time, everyone would hear the truth. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Sarah Mitchell stood before the most powerful people in the world to reveal equity's final and most profound discovery. The algorithm had uncovered something revolutionary, a mathematical proof that diversity and inclusion weren't just social goals, they were essential components of sustainable economic growth. What equity has shown us, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, is that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's mathematically unsustainable. The data proves that inclusive economies grow faster, adapt better, and survive crises more effectively than those built on bias. The presentation screen behind her displayed complex networks of data, showing how every instance of discrimination created ripple effects that weakened entire economic systems. But more importantly, it showed the solution, a new economic model based on genuine equality. Meanwhile, in a small auditorium in downtown Manhattan, Gerald Thompson was giving a very different kind of presentation. He stood before a group of executives who, like him, had once perpetuated discriminatory practices. But today wasn't about shame, it was about transformation. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just morally wrong, but fundamentally wrong about how business works. The loudest voice in the room isn't the strongest. The most confident opinion isn't the most correct. True strength comes from diversity of thought, experience, and perspective." His daughter Emily sat in the back of the room, tears in her eyes as she watched her father's genuine transformation. The rehabilitation program he helped create had already reformed dozens of executives, each of whom was now leading their own initiatives for corporate change. Back at Morton & Associates, Dr. Rodriguez had completed the company's transformation. The firm that had once been a symbol of corporate discrimination had become a case study in successful reform. Their profits had doubled, employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and they'd just been named the most innovative agency in the industry. But the real victory came 3 months later, when Equity's global implementation was complete. The system had been adopted by stock exchanges worldwide, making corporate equality a measurable factor in company valuations. Discrimination hadn't just become morally unacceptable, it had become financially impossible to sustain. Sarah Mitchell, standing in her office at the newly established Global Institute for Corporate Equality, looked out over the city skyline. On her wall hung the framed performance review, where Gerald had called her too loud. Below it was her newest award, the Nobel Prize in Economics, for proving the mathematical relationship between equality and economic sustainability. Gerald Thompson, now retired from his rehabilitation work, sat in his home office writing the final chapter of his memoir, The Cost of Silence, a reformed executive's journey to understanding. His relationship with his daughter had been rebuilt, stronger than ever, based on honesty and shared values. The final piece fell into place when the United Nations adopted the Mitchell Protocol as part of its Sustainable Development Goals. Equity's algorithms had become the global standard for measuring corporate health, making discrimination as obsolete as the typewriter. And in the end, the woman who was once told she was too loud had changed the very foundation of global business, not through volume, but through truth, not through force, but through wisdom, not through revenge, but through transformation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "You didn't just win the case, baby. You changed the world." She smiled, remembering the day Gerald had fired her. It felt like a lifetime ago. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out the termination notice, now a historical artifact in the corporate equality movement. Below Gerald's signature was a note she'd written to herself that day. Some voices need to be loud enough to echo through history. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Gerald Thompson became required reading in business schools worldwide. But more importantly, it became a reminder that true change doesn't come from tearing people down, but from transforming systems, reforming individuals, and proving that justice and prosperity go hand in hand. Equity continued its work, evolving and learning, ensuring that future generations would inherit a business world where everyone's voice could be heard. And in boardrooms across the globe, executives learned to listen not for the loudest voice, but for the truth that had always been there, waiting to be heard. As for Sarah Mitchell, she had one more surprise in store, but that's another story, one that would prove that the greatest changes often come not from the volume of our voices, but from the courage to speak truth to power, the wisdom to offer redemption, and the vision to transform adversity into lasting change.